Farewell, farewell, my native hame, thy lonely glens and heath-clad mountains. I'll seek a hymn far o'er the deep, my native hame. Farewell forever.
In the northernmost reaches of Scotland, overlooking the village of Helmsdale, lies a statue of an immigrant family. While the woman looks back at the land, clutching a babe, the man gazes outwards towards the ocean. The seemingly endless expanse of water promised a better life to many Highlanders 3 centuries ago, as a means of reaching a new land with greater opportunities. To some, this would be found on the shores of North Carolina. In July of 1739, a group of some 350 men, women, and children sailed from Argyll on the west coast of the Highlands, destined for North Carolina. Here they would find themselves in a foreign environment, unlike anything they had known in their homes on the Kintyre Peninsula. Despite the hardships they would encounter, many successfully settled in the New World, establishing what would become the largest community of Highlanders on the continent until well into the next century. This Argyll colony would be the first of many large immigrations from Scotland. By the end of the 18th century, thousands of Scots had settled in the Carolinas. They abandoned their homes in the Highlands, Islands, and Lowlands for a variety of reasons, and through their descendants would make an impact on the region that has lasted to this day.
There is an ancestral heartbeat in all of us. Let's hope so. We all need to hold that close.
While it is commonly believed that the Jacobite defeat at Culloden Moor was a primary cause of immigration, in the past few decades, historians have placed greater emphasis on a longer process of social and economic change.
The significance of Culloden is that it hugely accelerated, in a way, a process that was already underway. The Highland society, the old society, the clan society, was already under pressure.
At the time of the Argyll immigration, the Scottish Highlands and Islands were gradually undergoing great social and economic change. For centuries, the clan system formed the core of Gaelic society and was centered on kinship, ties of obligation, and land use. At the head of the clan was a chieftain who claimed direct descent from the founding figure and held a large swath of land. This land was divided into tax, which were leased to Dúine Uisle, or taxmen, who rented land to subtenants in return for military service. However, the importance of kinship ties between landlords and tenants began to lessen as the century progressed. The power of clan chiefs was fading, and as Scotland and England grew closer politically, socially, and economically, chieftains sought to emulate the lifestyle of English aristocrats. This would require a more effective means of making profit, leading clan chiefs to quickly adopt an emerging agricultural approach. In this new agricultural system, land was seen in terms of cash value and was cultivated to maximize profit. The traditional run-rig system, in which subtenants divided communal land into scattered rigs seen here, was thereby considered ineffective. As Highland landowners changed the way they leased their land, they began to understand their relationship to tenants in terms of commerce rather than kinship.
Culloden is just one thing that just gets added on as a layer to what's already happening. There were already a lot of changes happening in the Highlands especially, and also in the Lowlands before 1745-46.
I think supposing the Jacobite Rebellion and the Battle of Culloden had never happened, it would have fallen apart anyway. That's my opinion for what it's worth. But indubitably, the Battle of Culloden and the outcome of that accelerated the process.
After the battle, the British government made efforts to integrate the Highlands more closely with the rest of the Union by banning weapons, Highland dress, and bagpipes, which helped hasten the transformation of the chief from a patriarch into a landlord. Tacksmen were the first to be affected by this process, as their position as middlemen between chief and subtenant was increasingly seen as unnecessary. Landlords began raising rent on the land held by tacksmen, which was then passed on to subtenants. As this continued, many tacksmen refused to keep raising their tenants' rents and instead considered leaving the country altogether.
So a lot of them had become really dissatisfied with their lot and kind of passed that dissatisfaction along to people who were kind of under them as well in society, and they really start to organize these big voyages. So you see like bigger family groups, extended kin networks that are coming over as one large group.
Meanwhile, in North Carolina, the Scottish governor Gabriel Johnston sought to attract foreign Protestants to settle in the colony. Believing immigration a solution to North Carolina's slow economic growth, he wrote letters to his home country, offering immigrant parties tax exemptions. Johnston's efforts were key to the establishment of a large Highland community in the Upper Cape Fear River region. Governor Johnston's letters eventually reached the leaders of what would become the Argyll colony, who were perhaps among the first to feel the effects of social and economic change in the Highlands. Their landlord, the Duke of Argyll, had begun leasing land to outsiders in return for higher rents. Upon hearing word of opportunities in North Carolina, the leading kin-tier tacksmen made preparations to immigrate. In the summer of 1739, the party boarded the Thistle in Campbelltown, setting sail for Brunswick on the coast of North Carolina. 2 months later, they would arrive on new shores. After their arrival in Brunswick, the group made their way upriver to disperse in the Upper Cape Fear region, where they would settle on land of their own. This was a strange new environment for these immigrants. The land was low-lying, swampy, and sandy, and the climate warm and humid, ideal conditions for tropical disease to thrive. Thick forests of longleaf pines marked a sharp contrast to the open, mountainous terrain of the Highlands.
Certainly the first generation or two to come over, they were really the trailblazers, I guess you could say. But yeah, I mean, the idea of having to deal with high mortality rates in some cases, just trying to make a go of it with trying to, carve out a farm or a plantation from what felt like a wilderness, I'm sure, to many of them. Getting used to a new climate, getting used to new relationships, and maybe even more isolation than they had felt in the past. All of those things would have been quite difficult to get through.
While written evidence provides much information on the original Argyll settlement, very little material sources remain. The Scottish Heritage Centre at St. Andrews University in Laurenburg houses what is perhaps the only object left from this particular immigration party. This 18th century creamware ceramic platter was passed down to Jenny Bon McNeill, whose parents brought the item from their home in Scotland onto the voyage in 1739. The original Argyll community, of which Jenny Bon was a part, would soon expand to encompass a growing number of immigrants from the Highlands and Islands. In the decades after the group's departure, conditions had worsened back home. As rents increased, unemployment rates also rose. To make matters worse, the price of cattle, which formed the basis of the Highland economy, sharply declined in the 1740s and 1750s. In the following decades, landlords began moving tenants to poorer swaths of land in order to make room for sheep farming and to encourage work in the growing kelp industry. Similar factors were present in the lowlands. Starting in the 1750s, the region began urbanizing at a fast rate. Rural farm laborers were soon feeling the effects of agricultural change, and high rents and unemployment led many into towns or onto ships destined for the Americas. They, too, would begin contemplating immigration to North Carolina. But this story of upheaval and injustice is not the full picture. Ambition and search for greater opportunities led many to look towards the New World, as the abundance of inexpensive land promised a life without the oppression of landlords.
The notion that you would actually own your own land and that there were no landlords was remarkable.
The hope for a better future provided by immigration was encouraged by publications in Scottish newspapers. Perhaps the most notable of these is that by A Scotus Americanus, published in 1773 and circulated throughout the Highlands and Islands. The writer of this pamphlet proclaims the wonders of North Carolina, gives practical information about the climate and employment prospects, and encourages his fellow Scots to settle there. Perhaps the most significant factor for immigration was that of social networks, as the lasting ties of friends and relatives brought many Highland and Lowland Scots to the New World. This was facilitated by letter writing, which allowed news of the colonies to spread throughout Scotland. Many of these letters survive today, providing historians insight into conditions on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1770, a man named John Boyd wrote to his cousin Alexander McAllister, who was part of the original Argyle voyage in 1739. In his letter, Boyd sought information on the region, noting that
our family men are all upon the wing of leaving us and going for the New World of America.
In response, McAllister provided a comprehensive account of the immigrant experience, explaining that while it was not an easy process for families,
once they are settled, it is for life.
So the idea was if you can trust your family, you can trust their word, and you can have a clearer picture of what you can expect through immigration. And so that's where we see, the information going back and forth, the questions going back and forth between individuals about, what kind of crops can be grown in North Carolina, what kind of job opportunities there might be.
These networks of kith and kin, which were based on mutual trust and responsibility, drew many immigrants to North Carolina. Potential immigrants trusted the accounts of those who had migrated earlier. Their correspondence acted as a safety net in a strange new land, and immigrants knew that they could rely upon friends and relatives after arriving, if necessary. Thus, when one group of people immigrated, many more were likely to follow in a process of chain migration. In an account of his travels through the Hebrides in 1773, the Scottish writer James Boswell provides a vivid description of how this process may be visualized through dance.
We performed with much activity a dance which I suppose the immigration from Skye has occasioned. They call it America. Each of the couples, after the common involutions and evolutions, successively whirls round in a circle till all are in motion. And the dance seems intended to show how immigration catches till a whole neighbourhood is set afloat.
Whatever brought them to North Carolina, this influx of Highlanders led to the emergence of two trading settlements along the Cape Fear River at Cross Creek and Campbelltown. As they grew, the settlements would eventually join to form one town, which is today known as Fayetteville. From this hub, Highland immigrants dispersed into surrounding lands. The concentration of so many Highlanders in this region facilitated the formation of a distinct ethnic community, where Gaelic was the primary language spoken and marriage generally occurred between other members. Most of these immigrants were Presbyterian, although the colony was dominated by the Church of England at this time. Despite the fact that many settlers only spoke Gaelic, it was not until 1758 that they were served by a Gaelic-speaking minister. Nearly 20 years after the Argyll colony's arrival, the community finally welcomed the Reverend James Campbell, who would be the first of a series of Gaelic-speaking ministers in the region. This Gaelic New Testament, on display at the Scottish Heritage Centre, was printed in present-day Fayetteville in 1767. The Gaelic language would remain a crucial aspect of religious life here for decades. Gaelic was also the medium of a renowned bard who was one of the many Highland immigrants to North Carolina. The songs of Ian MacVittie, or John McRae, provide a rich account of the immigrant experience. Born in Kintail, he immigrated to North Carolina in 1774 and settled in present-day Moore County. Although its origins have previously been contested, he is most renowned for being the likely composer of John Catalan Savic O'Hulan Mulruin, which is considered to be the first Gaelic song composed in North America. In the form of a lullaby, the narrator describes the struggles experienced by immigrants in the New World, as well as their hopes for the future.
John Catalan Savic O'Hulan Mulruin, John Furach mar huis doen draast de natuur. Hakerin ag England biastisches clue, sma viesten at adelat ferig in you. Guraun na meddig ag hasnien drast, fo hwyr na calle nacht sieddig gwbrag. Nyr ilis yn sawrig se iown tais yn blas, Bí croen, bí úlan, bí siú gur a fas.
The Lowland Scots who settled in North Carolina had a very different immigration experience compared to the Highlanders. Rather than leaving in large parties, they tended to immigrate as individuals or in small family groups, and many came from a more affluent background. Instead of moving upriver upon arrival, they settled in the coastal towns of Wilmington, New Bern, and Edenton, where they more easily integrated into urban society. Yet they still retained a distinct Scottish identity and were considered by others to have the same clannish behavior associated with Highland Scots, despite not sharing the same Gaelic language or dress. From early on in North Carolina's history, Lowland Scots exerted a heavy influence on the local economy and politics. One notable Lowlander was James Murray, a merchant from Roxburghshire. He immigrated to the colony in 1735 and quickly became an established figure in Wilmington. His home and store once stood along Market Street, near the headquarters of other Scottish merchant firms. These merchants began to expand into the backcountry of North Carolina, collaborating with Highland traders and setting up stores in Cross Creek and Campbelltown. While the colony's economy appeared to be in a dismal state at the beginning of the century, by the end it had improved significantly, owing largely to the efforts of Scottish immigrants.
A lot of the early movers and shakers who built cities like Wilmington were Scots. And they had a pretty strong hold on the kind of merchant economy as well of the colony. So, kind of the Lowland Scots in particular have a lot of influence over that kind of social and economic development, even political development of the colony through the 18th century.
From the 1760s onward, Highland immigration to North Carolina rapidly increased and peaked between 1770 and 1775. This trend concerned both Scottish landlords and the British government, who began issuing negative accounts of North America to dissuade those planning to leave. These accounts became more frequent as tensions between Britain and her colonies worsened leading up to the American Revolution. The conflict that would soon emerge led to a temporary pause in immigration and would quickly affect those who had just arrived in North Carolina. One of these new arrivals was Flora MacDonald, the Hebridean woman famed for helping Prince Charles Edward Stuart escape after the Battle of Culloden. She immigrated to North Carolina in 1774 with her husband and children, eventually settling on a plantation in the Upper Cape Fear region. A member of the affluent tacksman class, she was renowned among her fellow Scots for earlier exploits. When war finally broke out, she and her husband would use their influence to promote support for King George III. However, many more struggled with the decision of choosing a side, which would inevitably lead to involvement in the conflict. For some Scots, including former Jacobites, allegiance to the king was a natural decision. This was especially true for newer arrivals to the colonies, who were required to swear an oath of loyalty to the crown before immigrating. Many others saw the revolution as a threat to their business interests and livelihoods, and therefore supported the king. Those who had lived through the Jacobite risings may have held greater reservations over the success of revolution, as they witnessed the grave consequences of defeat following the bloodshed at Culloden Moor. This sentiment is expressed in one of John McRae's songs, written after his arrival in North Carolina, just before the American Revolution broke out.
If you believe the truth, as sure as I am telling it, as certain as the dice, you will be the losers. However long you fight it, your end is failure, worse than how you began, and that is sure. But that is what will happen when they make you yield completely, and the strongest ones of the herd over there arrive. There will be hanging and torture, your cattle will be plundered. Neither law nor reason will be offered to rebels. And after this, you will repent that you fought impulsively against him.
While some Scottish immigrants leaned moderately towards the American cause, this was not an easy decision to make, and some attempted to remain neutral for as long as possible. But regardless of which cause they supported, Scottish immigrants were increasingly labeled as anti-American. This was the result of suspicion over their influence in the development of the colonies, their mercantile success, and perceived clannish behavior.
You know, a lot of Scottish merchants in particular, they are kind of like a face, I guess you could say, to some of the mercantilist agenda and some of the taxation that's coming along to the American colonies in that period. And so that's kind of leading up to this kind of what I and other historians have called Scotophobia, where they're being typecast as being kind of, you know, anti-American interest, even anti-liberalism, that sort of thing.
The association between Scots and loyalism was not unfounded, however. In 1775, the British government arranged for 2 Scottish officers to form a loyalist militia in the Cape Fear Highland community. The officials, alongside the governor of North Carolina, Josiah Martin, believed the Highlanders here were likely to rally in support of King George. With the aid of local leaders such as Allan MacDonald, they recruited around 1,100 to 1,500 men into a small, poorly armed militia. Their orders were to march eastward and join forces with troops arriving on a Royal Navy ship to secure North Carolina and its neighboring colonies for the Crown. Upon leaving Campbelltown in February of 1776, the militia was encircled and forced to cross Moore's Creek Bridge. However, all that remained of the bridge were beams greased with tallow, a trap set by the American regiment camped on the other side of the creek. Early in the morning on February 27th, the militia attempted to cross and swarm the enemy in a charge led by Lieutenant Colonel Donald MacLeod. MacLeod was the first to die. Before the battle was over, many more Highlanders were shot dead or left to drown in the creek. Several hundred Loyalists were ultimately imprisoned or made fugitives, although most common soldiers were allowed to return home.
And I think the rapidity of the defeat wasn't entirely down to American prowess. It was down to the fact that on the Highland side, most of the more rank and file recruits didn't really believe in this cause at all and didn't try very hard to fight, and effectively in many cases simply ran away. I don't think in many cases their heart was really in it. And it's noticeable, I think, that the American response to this, the Patriot response to this, was yes, to arrest some of the key ringleaders of the movement that culminated in the Battle of Moores Creek. But most of the rest of the rank and file soldiery on the Highland side, they said effectively, just go home as long as you promise that you're not going to do this again.
The bard John McRae was one of these defeated soldiers. Upon being captured, he was imprisoned with other Loyalists, including Alan MacDonald, and would compose a song lamenting this experience.
Get a min fan chalu chanel karari chot charam hamiski nagsha ach mi shesi guti lishlechen rivan va koreke hamiski nagsha ach nandike Cornwallis Sheen a gloss a solasach hamiski nagasha Gos grisarst the best and hooken Jackson star as one hamiski nagasha.
Soon after the battle, the North Carolina Provincial Congress officially declared support for independence. In the following years, a series of acts were passed, stripping leading Loyalists of their rights and forcing them to swear an oath to the American cause or face exile.
If you didn't own up to supporting the revolution and actually pledge your allegiance to the new state and the new U.S. government, then you were given a time limit to make it out of the state, and if not, you could be charged with treason.
Many Scottish Loyalists fled North Carolina for Charleston or Savannah, which were still controlled by the British. When these eventually fell to the Americans, they sailed back to the British Isles, having lost their possessions and experienced threats of violence. Among those that returned home was Flora MacDonald. Upon her husband Alan's release from prison, they sailed for Scotland, their few years in North America having been plagued by war and hardship. When the war finally ended, many more Scots remained in the state, where they would be settled for generations. Scottish immigration to North Carolina resumed after the war, but slowed in favor of destinations such as Canada and Australia. By the end of the century, the Highland immigrant community had expanded 50 miles outward from the original settlement at Campbelltown, which was renamed Fayetteville after the Marquis de Lafayette. The Highland settlement even extended into the Pee region of South Carolina. In the following decades, many Scottish families began moving further afield to Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, where they settled on land from which indigenous peoples had been forcibly removed. It was in this post-war period that Highland Scots began to settle in Laurinburg, in present-day Scotland County. The traces of these immigrants can be found in the old Stewartsville Cemetery. Despite the distance of time and place, these immigrants remained connected to their birthplaces, even in death. Gaelic remained a central aspect of life in these Highland settlements, and especially in the churches. Congregations like that at the old Laurel Hill Presbyterian Church in Laurenburg would have heard both Gaelic and English services. The Reverend Colin Lindsay, a Presbyterian minister born in Scotland, preached in Gaelic to various congregations in North Carolina. He later moved to Scotland County and is buried in the Old Stewartsville Cemetery. The Gaelic language was thriving to the extent that there was an active book trade in Fayetteville, where Gaelic texts were printed. Angus Curry, one of several owners of this Gaelic New Testament seen earlier, wrote that he purchased the book in Fayetteville in 1793. Many visitors to the region at this time noted the presence of Gaelic. Henrietta Liston, wife of the British ambassador to the US, wrote in 1797 that
the Gaelic language is still prevalent amongst them
and was spoken by both preachers and enslaved people. In 1828, a Scottish tourist named Captain Basil Hall commented that
the number of these Highlanders and their descendants who retain almost exclusively their native language is so considerable that a clerk who understands Gaelic forms a necessary part of the post office establishment.
The use of Gaelic would ultimately decline as generations passed. By the 1860s, Gaelic church services were uncommon, and the language was rarely spoken outside of the home. Many other distinctive aspects of Highland culture also began to fade as the 19th century progressed. Traditional Highland dress, music, and dance customs slowly disappeared, and Scottish Americans saw their links with family in Scotland weaken. Instead, the descendants of immigrants gradually began to relate more closely with an American identity. While a Scottish Highland identity did remain in younger generations, it began to take a different form under the influence of Romanticism. In particular, the novels of Jane Porter and Sir Walter Scott transformed understandings of Scottish culture and the ancestral homeland, as did the poetry of Robert Burns. While this connection to Scotland did remain, the North Carolina Scots had ultimately assimilated into wider society. Something changed in the 20th century. Here in the mountains of western North Carolina, Scottish culture experienced a great revival as a result of the efforts of two people. In 1956, Agnes McRae Morton and Donald MacDonald founded a Highland Games on Grandfather Mountain in Linville. The location chosen was the former site of Scottish immigrant Alexander McRae's farm and guest house. Now known as the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games, the event has grown steadily over the years. Over the course of a long weekend in July, the meadow is transformed into a sea of tartan as thousands of attendees converge to celebrate Scottish culture.
We are the largest gathering of Scottish clans and Scottish families on the face of the earth. And we celebrate that, we cultivate that, we advertise that, and people come.
Among other aims, the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games seeks to foster and restore interest in traditional dancing, piping, drumming, athletic achievement, music, and Gaelic culture. Highland dance, piping, drumming, fiddle, and Celtic harp competitions are held throughout the weekend, and the Games welcomes an array of traditional music performers from across the US and Scotland. Alongside this, the event has greatly contributed to a revival of Gaelic in the region.
We provide elementary Gaelic instruction, both in teaching people a few Gaelic words and Gaelic phrases, and we also do Gaelic songs. And so we will have North American-based instructors. We will have people come over from Scotland that are part of that. And so there's a big investment in doing that. And then, of course, as part of the Games, we do have the big singing competition, which is the Gaelic Mod. And that's something that's very unique to Grandfather Mountain, and something that we've done for years and years and will continue to do.
The Diaspora's ties with Scotland remain, although in different ways than in the 18th and 19th centuries. Organizations like Clan Societies and Scottish Heritage USA offer ways for Americans to remain connected to Scotland, most notably by raising money for the protection of Scottish historical sites. Alongside this, they provide a sense of community for those who want to celebrate Scottish heritage and culture, and often promote travel to Scotland. In a reverse of the journey their ancestors took, Americans of Scottish descent are returning to Scotland as tourists. In this roots tourism, many trace their heritage by visiting the villages and islands from whence their families originated, as well as historical sites that have significance to their families, such as Culloden Battlefield. In 2019, the governmental tourist organization Visit Scotland reported that the USA was once again Scotland's largest international source market, with 636,000 Americans visiting that year. In a survey conducted several years prior, Scottish ancestry was cited as a common motivation for American visitors. For those that reported a connection to Scotland, ancestry was the most frequent type of connection. Furthermore, just as the work of Burns, Porter, and Scott inspired so many Scottish Americans in the 19th century, Scottish-themed literature and film today has doubtlessly encouraged Americans to explore their Scottish heritage. The story of Scottish immigration remains alive in the family histories of those who live in the region.
I've got a seventh great-grandfather that was at Culloden. He went back home after the battle and was arrested in August of 1746 and put in prison. He was transported as a young man. He was part of the groups that drew lots, and he was transported and sold at the block in Virginia as a 17-year-old. And somehow he made it through all that hardship and lived to be 95 years old.
It just so happens that I actually am related to the McAllisters. I didn't find that out until much later on in my research. But it was quite fun to be able to look through correspondence and then every once in a while see a name that I'm like, oh, look, it's my fifth great-grandfather or something like that.
While not all Americans of Scottish descent celebrate their heritage by dressing in tartan or learning traditional dancing or piping, this emphasis on ancestry more broadly is a noticeable feature of American society.
America is a melting pot, and so we are all, I think, very vested in where we came from. We all need to hold that close. We all came from people.
The Scottish identity that remains with the diaspora is not the same as it was generations prior. Just as Scots left their mark on the region, the region has also influenced their descendants.
I do not think of myself as Scottish. I'm American. But I hold a special fondness in my heart for Scotland.
The impact of the Scottish diaspora is still seen in North Carolina today through the Highland Games, Scottish place names, gravestones, and artifacts left behind.
They're able to carry that culture on for generations, and having such a large descendant population here, I think, keeps that going for the long term.
Although it has transformed over the centuries, Scottish heritage remains an integral part of this region and holds a special significance to many Carolinians and their personal identities. Since the 18th century, thousands of Scots had made North Carolina their home, persevering through difficult conditions in search of a better life. Once, many of these immigrants were part of a distinct Highland community in which Gaelic and other traditions thrived. Through their participation in religious life, trade, and war, these Scots have helped shape the development and culture of the state, leaving a mark that is still visible today. In a uniquely American form, their Scottish identity remains within their descendants. Despite the distance of time and space, this diaspora continues to be connected to Scotland through a shared history and traditions. What was once a hostile foreign land to earlier immigrants is now the home of their descendants, which has given rise to new ties and identities that no longing for the ancestral homeland can erase.